Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Gedeb Lalesa wash processed Ethiopia from Swerl Coffee Roasters. And there's the bag right there. And Swerl, based out of Falkenberg, Sweden, and they're a coffee roaster that's appeared on this channel on several occasions, including our recent review of the La Floresta, a wash processed Colombian coffee. And in that review, I made reference to another coffee that we would be reviewing from Swerl, which is of course this one right here, as I did make a number of comparisons between those two coffees, but we'll certainly be making even more comparisons between them in this review. So let's go ahead and see how this one turned out, as this right here is day 42. And recipe we went with for this coffee was once again Swerl's recipe, which is a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 94 degrees Celsius, batch 201 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind. Roast profile for this coffee. Once again, we kind of alluded to this one being on the lighter side of things with that term Nordic light, which once upon a time was extremely light, but even then I wouldn't necessarily say that it's an extremely light coffee. It's very light, definitely still on the lighter side of things relative to a majority of Nordic-based coffee roasters, and it is a filter roast once again, so all of that's to say that this is a pretty light coffee by most standards and metrics. With all that out of the way, let's go and start discussing this coffee. Day 15, first impression, and we did opt for the V60, and the cup was expectedly light and slightly more tame, as it is in line with the expectations for a lighter profiled wash processed Ethiopian coffee. Mostly soft and delicate with a citric forward profile and some subtle florals in the finish. A pretty straightforward start in general, as that's kind of exactly what I was expecting for this coffee roaster. We move on to day 18 as we opted for the Chemex, and it was offering a pretty similar experience, with it being a little bit more in line with the listed brown sugar profile, all encompassed by a bit of tropicality in a mostly citric sense. Likely felt that this coffee needed a fair bit more time, and that's what's been kind of interesting about the contrast of these two Swerl coffees, is the La Floresta was really impressive right from the start, and this coffee was still requiring more time to really open up, as the first couple of impressions I had with this coffee were mostly neutral. We move on to day 21 as we opted for the April brewer, and this was the best the coffee had been to this point, as it was offering the most amount of intensity and sweetness in a slightly fruit candied sense, and also plenty more of the listed brown sugar aspect. Light bodied and pretty clean as expected. Even then, I would say that this coffee was still relatively tame, especially to the La Floresta. And once again, kind of brewing these coffees side by side, I said, okay, this La Floresta is really impressive, and this Gedeb Wash Ethiopia is just fine. We move on to day 24 as we opted for the V60 with Swerl's recipe, and the coffee was the best it had been to this point, as there was a better defined, sweeter citric profile in line with the listed pineapple. And it's the first time I felt that listed pineapple, as I'm like, this is actually very nice. It does have a much sweeter citric profile to it in that sense. Cleaner all around with a very nice sugary finish to the cup, as it was just a better all around experience. Day 27 through the Chemex with Swerl's recipe, and it was another really nice day, if not quite as good as the previous day, with the coffee offering higher intensity than some of the earlier days, especially in terms of the tropical intensity. Much more of the listed pineapple, with the apricot being a little bit more pronounced than it had been in some of the earlier days. Definitely going along the lines of the sugariness that they do have in this one, especially with it being much more on the stone fruit side of things. Pretty lovely nonetheless, as I found this coffee was really improving a lot. Day 30, back through the V60 with Swerl's recipe, and this was a standout day for the coffee, as this one was trending in a much more positive direction. And that's where the contrast of these two coffees really comes into play, as at this time, on this day, the La Floresta really seemed to kind of go in the other direction, where this coffee was certainly improving significantly, as this one had an immensely clean and tropical base to it, with a near banana-like aspect to the cup. And banana is an interesting flavor note, because it's usually seen in much more processed coffees, and when I tasted it, it's much more because it has a rum-like feel. So experiencing it in a wash-processed coffee was certainly interesting, especially given how clean and defined it felt. Still an abundance of sweeter stone fruits and citric qualities, especially within the sugary sense. Terrific clarity, wonderful day, a true standout day of this coffee. Day 33 through the Chemex with our standard recipe, and we settled on the V60 for this one as well, as the best of this coffee has been experienced on the Chemex of this point. I should say the best Chemex experience we've had of this coffee was at this point. Some subtle floral components to it, but a primary focus does skew on the sugary fruit base with the tropical citric feel to it yet again. on day 36 through the V60 with Swerl's recipe, and this one was nearly as good as that day 30 mark, with the best of the coffee coming after a lengthy cool down, plenty of the sugary sweetness, initially a citric sense right off brew, but the cup does open up into much more of the tropical banana-like feel with a nicely defined sugary stone fruit within the finish. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have a couple of level 4, so we'll start with the cleanliness level 4. So this one was definitely very clean. It was certainly cleaner than the La Floresta. We are working with a wash processed Ethiopian coffee, and given the very nice definition and clarity of this coffee, if anything, it does belong on the slightly higher side of the level 4, as this one was definitely a very clean coffee. Finish level 4. And the finish is kind of interesting because it did mostly skew in a more sugary kind of brown sugar sense that they do have listed on here, and it made a lot of sense given that this entire coffee did have a much more sugary feel to it, at times a little bit more candied, though I do have to say La Floresta, especially on its earlier days, was much more candied in terms of that sweetness, where this one was a little bit more sugary. Nonetheless, definitely justified there at that level 4 mark, especially with the sweetness being there at that level 4. As this one, especially on the later days, was sweeter than the La Floresta. Earlier days, once again, would give it to the La Floresta being a little bit more sweet, but on the later days of this one was definitely on the sweeter side of things. Initially, I was thinking level 3, but towards the end, especially with the fruit profiles of this one, it justified there at the level 4 mark. Citrus fruit, level 4. And yeah, they do have that grilled pineapple note listed on here, and it is definitely on the, we'll say, better defined qualities I've experienced from any coffee that does have a listed pineapple note. So massive credit to them in that regard. That's actually primarily where the citric qualities within this one comes from. Stone fruit, level 3, and there definitely was a fair bit of the sugary stone fruit aspects. This one, apricot, once again, I think is the note that they have listed on here. I can definitely see that. At times, it also did feel a little bit of a ripe peach sense to it. And we'll go ahead and move on to the level 3s. We'll start with the acidity level 3. Not the brightest coffee out there, and I think maybe the comparison with the La Floresta, which was a pretty bright coffee, did tone this one down to that level 3 mark. Florals, level 3. Honestly, for a wash processed Ethiopian, the floral qualities of this one were also toned down, and it is kind of interesting that both the swirl coffees we've had has had this lingering kind of subtle, undefined background floral component to them. We move on, and one thing I want to stop and discuss real quick is the berry fruit is there at that level 2 mark. And given that banana technically belongs in that berry category, I'm wondering if I want to adjust and change that to being at that level 3, because that was something that I felt enough to justify being there at the level 3, especially given that the florals were also there at the level 3, and there wasn't anything overly defined about that in comparison to the berry attribute of this one. So kind of interesting. I might adjust that in the tasting wheel. Caramel, level 3. As mentioned, there is a candied sweetness. Once again, this one was a little bit more sugary as opposed to maybe truly candied, but even then, I think it was justified putting it there at that level 3 mark, as that mostly is representative of the brown sugar. And then final thing worth discussing, body, level 2. It did have a nice bit of texture to it as well, which isn't always the case for wash processed Ethiopians, but that did give it just a little bit more depth in general. So as I am looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. One of the really big reasons why I wanted to compare and contrast these two coffees that we had from Swerl was because they were complete opposites of each other. As one coffee did seem to kind of go down, it did seem to kind of tone itself down and lose its intensity. The other coffee did seem to accentuate a lot of the more intense qualities of it. So one drastically improved and one seemed to kind of downgrade. It just didn't quite follow along the same trajectory that this coffee did have. So initially when I was working with both these coffees, I thought the La Floresta was going to be the coffee that I was much more excited to discuss, but I was actually much more excited to discuss this coffee because I've said in the past, I don't necessarily enjoy reviewing wash processed Ethiopian coffees because at times they can be a little bit more generic and boring of a review in general. So having this one offer a slightly more unique characteristic, most specifically in that grilled pineapple and banana-like sense, was definitely a very enjoyable experience for this coffee. And I feel like just like with what I said for the La Floresta, if this coffee would have been just as good and consistent right from the start, then this coffee would have been one of my favorite wash processed Ethiopian coffees that we'd reviewed this year. Some of those standout days, especially that day 30 mark, was one of the best experiences I've had of a wash processed Ethiopian coffee this year. So that definitely does set the standard for future reviews from this coffee roaster, because I definitely want to try out more things from them. I don't think that they're going to be featured in this year's Cafe Box Advent Calendar, which is unfortunate because I'm very curious about what this coffee roaster is capable of. The type of person I would suggest this coffee to. This one's kind of an interesting suggestion. So we'll start out with the lighter profiled aspect of this one. Outside of that, definitely more sweetness in a sugary sense, and definitely much more of a fruit profile, especially in terms of that citric quality to it. In addition to that, you get a nice mixture of all three, as there's a nice combination of the stone fruit qualities and that interesting berry tone to it, much more in a tropical sense, as both the coffees we had from them were much more tropical forward. So that's the first place I want to start. Terrific clarity, terrific definition, and that's just kind of the best direction I can point somebody towards for this one. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been your review of the Gedeb Lalesa wash processed Ethiopia from Swerl Coffee Roasters. Thank you for watching.